Right now, somewhere in America, a diabetic is rationing insulin to pay rent, not because the drug is new, not because it's rare, because a medicine that was deliberately sold for $1 in 1923 by the man who discovered it on purpose, so no one would ever have to die from not affording it, now costs $300 a vial. That's not a typo. $1 in 1923, $300 today. And the man who made that choice, who said insulin belongs to the world, died never knowing what the world did with it. Here's what's actually in your medicine cabinet if you're a type 1 diabetic in America today. A vial of a molecule that was understood in 1922, a molecule whose core science belongs to no one because the men who discovered it gave it away, and a price tag that has climbed more than 1,000% in the last 30 years, not because anything changed about the molecule, but because of a system that turned a public gift into a private goldmine. This is the story of how that happened. It starts with a dying boy in Toronto and ends with dying people in America. People who knew exactly what they needed to survive and simply could not afford it. But before we get to the dying, we need to understand the world that insulin was born into. Because what makes this story so devastating isn't just what happened after 1923, it's what was happening before. January 1922, Toronto General Hospital, Children's Ward. Leonard Thompson is 14 years old. He weighs 65 pounds. He is in a diabetic coma. Before this month, a type 1 diabetes diagnosis killed you. Always. Just a question of how long. The only treatment was starvation. Doctors starved patients of sugar to slow the body's collapse. Children sat in cribs and wasted away. Their families and wasted away. Their families, watching. The ward smelled of acetone from dying tissue. There was nothing else to offer. Mothers brought their children in and were told to take them home and make them comfortable. Comfortable meant watching them dissolve, pound by pound over weeks or months, until the coma came and then the end. Physicians were not cruel. They were honest. They had nothing, not a pill, not a procedure, not a prayer that medicine could back up. The children who lasted longest were the ones whose families could enforce the strictest starvation diets. Fewer carbohydrates meant slower decline. Some children managed a year or two on diets so severe they were barely alive in any meaningful sense. They were thin to the point of translucency. They were weak. They were in constant, low-grade crisis. And then they died anyway. Type 1 diabetes in 1921 was a sentence. The only question was how long the warden would take. Then a surgeon with no research experience, working in a borrowed lab with 10 dogs, and a medical student he'd just met, injected Leonard Thompson with something extracted from a dog's pancreas. His name was Frederick Banting. He was 30 years old. He had a small-town Ontario medical practice. No publications, no research credentials, and an idea he'd scribbled in a notebook after reading a medical journal article late at night. The idea was speculative, half-formed, and based on a hypothesis that most established scientists had already investigated and abandoned. Banting believed that the key to treating diabetes lay in the pancreas, specifically in the clusters of cells called the islets of Langerhans, which appeared to produce some substance that regulated blood sugar. Previous researchers had tried to extract that substance. They'd failed. The pancreatic digestive enzymes broke it down before it could be isolated. Banting's idea was different. What if you tied off the pancreatic ducts? The digestive enzyme-producing cells would atrophy from lack of function, but the islets might survive. And from those surviving islets, you might be able to extract whatever it was they produced. He took the idea to John McLeod, a professor of physiology at the University of Toronto. MacLeod was skeptical. He had good reasons to be. The theory was unproven, the experimenter was untested, and the field was littered with failed attempts at this exact problem. But he gave Banting laboratory space, 10 dogs, and the assistance of a 22-year-old medical student named Charles Best. MacLeod then left for a summer vacation in Scotland. He would later be criticized for this, though it's worth noting he had responsibilities he couldn't simply abandon. The point is that Banting and Best were largely on their own through the critical summer of 1921. The work was grinding. Dogs died. Extracts failed. The Toronto summer was brutal. The equipment was inadequate, and the two men were making it up as they went. They tried extract after extract. Some lowered blood sugar, but caused violent reactions. Some did nothing. The dogs they were working with had been made diabetic by having their pancreases removed. When the dogs went into diabetic crisis, Banting and Best injected their extracts and watched. By the fall of 1921, something was working. Blood sugar was dropping, dogs were recovering. A biochemist named James Collip joined the team and began the critical work of purifying the extract to remove the components that cause toxic reactions. What emerged from Collip's purification process was something that had never existed before in any usable form. They called it insulin, from the Latin for island, for the islets of Langerhans where it originated. Leonard Thompson received the first human injection on January 11, 1922. The initial preparation still caused abscesses. Collip refined it further. A second injection followed. Within days, Leonard's blood glucose levels fell dramatically. The acetone smell that marked dying diabetics faded from his breath. He gained weight. He gained strength. Then the team moved through the ward. One by one, children who had been dying were injected. One by one, they began to recover. There are accounts from physicians and nurses who were present that describe it as something that felt like witnessing a resurrection. Children who had been unconscious for days opened their eyes. Children who hadn't stood in weeks got out of bed. A ward that had been a place where families came to say goodbye became a place where families came to take their children home. Banting refused to put his name on the patent. He thought it was unethical for a physician to profit from a discovery that would save lives. That was his position, and he did not waver from it. So he, Best, and Collip each sold their patent rights to the University of Toronto for $1. $1 each. The university licensed production to Eli Lilly and Company in the United States. Large-scale manufacturing began in 1923. Within a year, insulin was being produced at a scale that made it widely available and affordable. The Nobel Prize came in 1923, awarded to Banting and MacLeod. Banting was furious that Best had been excluded and immediately announced he was sharing his prize money with Best. MacLeod responded by sharing his with Collip. The gesture captured something essential about these men. They had not done this for recognition or money. They had done it because children were dying and they believed they could stop it. Frederick Banting died in a plane crash in Newfoundland in February 1941. He was 49 years old. He never saw what his discovery became. For the next 6 decades, the story of insulin is, on balance, a story of genuine progress. Animal insulin, extracted from the pancreases of pigs and cattle, was the standard through the 1970s. It worked. It was imperfect, because animal insulin differs slightly from human insulin and some patients developed immune reactions over time, but it was available. It was affordable. It kept people alive, The next transformation came in 1982 when Eli Lilly introduced Humulin, the first synthetic human insulin produced using recombinant DNA technology. Genetically modified bacteria were engineered to produce insulin identical to what the human pancreas makes. This was a genuine scientific achievement. Humulin was safer than animal insulin for patients who developed reactions, and it was more consistent in quality, and it was patented. Then came the analog insulins of the 1990s and 2000s. Analog insulins are insulin molecules with slight structural modifications that change how quickly they're absorbed or how long they last in the body. Rapid-acting analogs like Humalog and Novolog peak faster than regular human insulin, making it easier to match insulin dosing to meals. Long-acting analogs like Lantus and Levemir provide more stable background coverage than NPH insulin. These were real improvements for many patients. They made management easier, and for some people, they reduced the risk of dangerous low blood sugar episodes. The science behind them was legitimate, and every single one of them was legitimate. And every single one of them was Bunyonaire, and every single one of them was Tendula, patented. Not just the molecule, the formulation, the delivery device, the concentration, the method of use. Layer after layer of intellectual property was built around each analog product, creating what patent lawyers call a thicket, a dense web of overlapping protections that made it extraordinarily difficult for any competitor to produce a true intangible generic. Write this down because this is the mechanism that explains everything that follows. When a small molecule drug, a pill for example, goes off patent, generic manufacturers can copy the chemical compound and sell it at a fraction of the price. Lipitor went off patent. Generic atorvastatin appeared. Prices collapsed by more than 90%. Insulin is a biologic, a complex protein produced by living cells. Biologics are much harder to copy precisely. The regulatory pathway for a generic biologic, called a biosimilar, is longer, more expensive, and more demanding than the pathway for a generic pill. And because insulin manufacturers kept filing new patents on new formulations, new devices, and new methods of use, the effective patent life of insulin products extended far beyond the original discovery. By the 1990s, 3 companies controlled virtually the entire global insulin market. Eli Lilly in the United States, Novo Nordisk in Europe, Sanofi, the French pharmaceutical giant. Between them, they manufactured nearly all of the world's supply of modern insulin products. This is the market structure into which the price increases arrived. In 1996, a vial of Humalog, Eli Lilly's rapid-acting analog, cost approximately $21. Write that down, $21, 1996. By 2001, the price had reached $35. By 2006, it was $54. By 2011, it crossed $100. By 2013, it was $120. By 2016, the list price had reached $275. That is a 1,300% increase in 20 years. The extraordinary thing about these price increases is that they happened in near lockstep across all 3 manufacturers. When Lilly raised the price of Humalog, Novo Nordisk raised the price of Novolog, and Sanofi raised the price of Apidra, not by the same amount on the same day. That would have raised antitrust concerns, but consistently in the same direction, year after year, at rates that tracked each other closely enough that researchers describe the pricing behavior as a de facto oligopoly, even without evidence of explicit coordination. The companies pointed to a parallel system to explain why their list prices didn't represent what patients actually paid. Pharmacy benefit managers, the little-known intermediaries who negotiate between drug companies and insurance plans, extracted significant rebates from manufacturers in exchange for favorable formulary placement. A drug company that wanted its insulin to be the preferred product for a major insurer's plan had to pay to be in that position. Those payments in the form of rebates and discounts could be substantial, sometimes reducing the net price the insurer paid to less than half the list price. This created a paradox that patients lived inside without fully understanding it. The list price of insulin kept climbing. The net price, what large insurers actually paid after rebates, climbed more slowly and in some cases barely moved for years at a time. Drug companies and PBMs pointed to this and said, "See, the list price isn't the real price. The system is working, but the patient's out-of-pocket cost was calculated on the list price, not the net price. Deductibles were a percentage of the list price. Coinsurance was a percentage of the list price. And for the tens of millions of Americans who were uninsured, underinsured, or stuck in high-deductible plans, the list price was exactly what they paid." So the gap between the story the industry told about prices, rebates, net prices, discounts, and the story patients lived, $300 at the pharmacy counter every month forever, was enormous. And in that gap, people were making decisions about whether to eat or inject. The formulary system added another layer of chaos. Insurance plans don't simply cover all insulins. They maintain lists, formularies, of which drugs are covered at which cost-sharing tier. A drug on the preferred tier might cost $20 per month. The same drug on a non-preferred tier might cost $150, and formularies change every year. A diabetic who had been stable on one insulin for a decade could receive a letter in November telling them that starting January 1st, their insulin was moving to a higher tier or being removed from coverage entirely. They could appeal. They could ask their doctor to prescribe an alternative. They could pay the non-preferred price. What they couldn't do was simply continue using what was keeping them alive at the price they'd been paying. The psychological weight of this system on diabetic patients was documented in study after study. Surveys found that a significant percentage of insulin-dependent diabetics had rationed their insulin at some point, taken less than prescribed to make a vial last longer. Some skipped doses. Some split doses. Some mixed prescription insulin with older, over-the-counter formulations that were less effective. The clinical consequences of insulin rationing are well understood. Erratic blood sugar control, increased risk of diabetic ketoacidosis, long-term damage to kidneys, eyes, and nerves. The deaths that resulted were not always immediate. Some were. Many were slow, occurring over years of suboptimal control, complications accumulating until a crisis arrived that the body couldn't survive. But some deaths were immediate and named and refused to stay private. Alex Smith turned 26 in May 2017. That same month, he aged off his parents' health insurance under the terms of the Affordable Care Act, which covered dependents until 26. His insulin cost $1,100 a month without coverage. He made $12 an hour as a restaurant manager. He applied for Medicaid. He was told he made too much to qualify. He didn't make enough to pay the insulin bill. He started rationing. His mother, Nicole, found him dead in his apartment on June 27, 2017. He was 26 years old. He had been diabetic since he was 15. He knew what he needed. He could not afford it. Josh Wilkerson was 22. He lived in Texas. His insulin costs after losing insurance coverage were similarly unaffordable. He began rationing. He died in June 2017, the same month as Alex Smith. His mother, Antoinette, held press conferences. She said her son was not a statistic. She kept saying it until enough people listened. Shane Patrick Boyle was the same age. He was caring for his dying mother in Arkansas when he lost his health insurance. He started a GoFundMe to cover the cost of insulin. He needed $50 more. He died of diabetic ketoacidosis before the campaign reached its goal. $50. The pharmaceutical industry's response to these deaths was consistent. The companies had patient assistance programs, they had discount cards, they had programs for people who couldn't afford insulin. Those programs existed, they were real, the companies invested resources in them. What those programs required was paperwork, qualification criteria, application processes, and the time and stability to navigate bureaucratic systems, which is to say, they required the kind of administrative capacity that is the first thing to disappear when a person is in financial crisis. Alex Smith knew the programs existed. He was trying to navigate the system while working, applying for Medicaid, and rationing his supply. The system moved slower than his insulin ran out. Congressional investigations beginning in 2019 turned the internal pricing documents of the three manufacturers into public record. What those documents showed was that the companies had been aware for years that list price increases did not primarily benefit them, that after rebates and discounts, their actual revenue per unit grew far more slowly than the list price. What they also showed was that the companies understood the list price increases were causing harm to patients and continued them anyway. The documents showed email threads in which executives discussed the optics of price increases. They showed awareness that patients were rationing. They showed projections of revenue against projections of political risk. They showed that the calculations being made were not primarily medical or ethical calculations, they were financial ones. This is not to say that pharmaceutical companies are uniquely villainous among large corporations. They are large corporations operating within a system that rewards the behavior the documents recorded. The problem is not that the people running these companies were monsters. The problem is that the system was designed in a way that made these outcomes logical. Political pressure finally produced movement in 2023. Eli Lilly announced a cap of $35 per month for insulin for insured patients. Novo Nordisk and Sanofi followed within weeks. The Inflation Reduction Act, passed in 2020 and implemented in 2023, capped insulin costs at $35 per month for Medicare beneficiaries. These were real concessions. They mattered for millions of people. The political pressure that produced them, years of advocacy by families of people who had died rationing insulin, combined with sustained congressional attention, was the mechanism that worked when market forces did not. And then Congress tried to extend the $35 cap to the uninsured. The provision failed. 50 Republican senators voted against it. The uninsured, the people most likely to be rationing, most likely to be making the impossible calculation between insulin and rent, were excluded from the federal protection. The structural problems underneath the caps remain largely intact. Evergreening continues. New insulin products with new patents continue to enter the market. The rebate system remains opaque. Biosimilar insulins have begun to appear. Civica RX, a non-profit drug manufacturer, introduced a $35 insulin product, and other biosimilars have entered the market at lower prices, but their penetration is limited by the same formulary and rebate dynamics that drove the original price increases. Insurers have financial incentives through the rebate system to keep branded products on preferred formulary tiers, even when biosimilars are cheaper. The men who sold the patent for $1 believed they were doing something permanent. They believed they were placing insulin beyond the reach of ordinary commercial logic. They thought the public good of the discovery, combined with the moral clarity of their own gesture, would be sufficient. They did not anticipate pharmacy benefit managers. They did not anticipate patent thickets. They did not anticipate evergreening or formulary switches or coingerance calculated on inflated list prices. They could not have. These mechanisms did not exist in 1923. They were invented later piece by piece by people who were not thinking about Leonard Thompson. Frederick Banting sold his patent for $1 because he believed medicine belonged to the people who needed it. He believed the right to survive a disease you were born with should not depend on your ability to pay for the hormone your body couldn't produce. He was not naive. He understood that manufacturing cost money. He understood that Eli Lilly needed to cover its costs and earn a reasonable return. He simply believed that the molecule itself, the knowledge that this thing existed and worked, belonged to everyone. The system that grew around his discovery did not share that belief. It took a public gift and turned it into a revenue stream. It took a molecule understood in 1922 and layered patent after patent on top of it until the original act of generosity was buried under 1,000% of price increases and 3 named deaths in a single month and millions of unnamed consequences stretching across decades. Alex Smith knew about insulin the same way Leonard Thompson knew about it. He knew exactly what it was and exactly what it did. The difference between them is not science, it is not medicine. It is not the molecule, which has not essentially changed in a century. The difference is the system that was built around the molecule. Banting gave the world $1's worth of humanity. The world has been charging interest ever since. Whether that system reflects a failure of regulation, a failure of political will, or simply the correct operation of a market that was never designed to keep people alive, that question is still being answered. The $35 cap is one answer. The exclusion of the uninsured is another. The biosimilars entering the market are a third. None of them is complete. None of them is permanent. What is permanent is the story. The boy who weighed 65 pounds in a Toronto hospital. The surgeon who believed medicine belonged to everyone. The dollar. And the distance between that dollar and what's in your medicine cabinet today. If you're one of the 8 million Americans who depend on insulin to stay alive, that distance is not measured in scientific progress. It is measured in the choices a system makes about who deserves to live. If this story changed how you think about what's in your medicine cabinet, subscribe and drop a like. We go deep on the hidden machinery behind the systems that shape your life, the ones written in patents and formularies and congressional votes that most people never see until the bill arrives. There's another story coming that you will not want to miss. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.